Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and this is the Improve Your Chess series on YouTube to help you play chess better. In today's video, I thought we'd look at an interesting question, which is when beginners are taught the value for trading for knights and bishops, they're taught that they're worth 3 pawns apiece. And even in more sophisticated numbers like Larry Kaufman's, I think Larry currently has knights and bishops on the average, not in every position of course, as worth about 3.5 pawns each, which means still knights and bishops are worth almost identical. And when Larry actually used a computer to measure millions of positions to see what the actual value of each piece was, I think if I remember in his initial run, he had the knight and the bishop worth within 2/100th of a pawn of each other. If you went down to hundredths, it was within 2/100ths. And he said that's so close that the error of his measurements is greater than the difference between the two pieces, which means they are indeed worth truly almost exactly the same. Now that does not include the concept of the advantage of the bishop pair, often just called the bishop pair, which doesn't mean you have two bishops. It means one side has two bishops and the other side does not. And when you do that, it has a distinct advantage, which Larry measured at about 1/2 a pawn. But if you just have a knight and a bishop, they're worth on the average the same. Now, in some positions, knights are worth a lot more than bishops, and in some positions, bishops are worth a lot more than knights. But it's amazing that on the average, they came out to be almost exactly the same. So let's take a look at how these basic ideas for each piece, these basic features, elements, compare, and we'll see that in some cases one is much better than the other, and in other cases the other is much better than that one. And it turns out these things almost completely neutralize out. So even though you have completely different types of moving pieces, the values are almost the same. All right, so the first concept we're going to start with, I call potential mobility. Now I wrote about this, I hate to say it, 45 years ago. I wrote a book called Elements of Positional Evaluation. And it was a little bit of an unfortunate name because people confused positional with position. They thought I was talking about position evaluation, which I did in my video a couple weeks ago where I did evaluation criteria. But I was really talking about positional aspects of the pieces and comparing pieces, not necessarily the entire position. And one of the concepts I used, which was certainly not new with me, but maybe the name was called potential mobility. Potential mobility is simply the number of squares a piece can move to if the board was empty from a given square. So if we look at the potential mobility of a knight on h8, if the board's empty, a knight on h8 has 2 possible moves. So its potential mobility is 2. Now we have some symmetries in chess that enable us to figure out where the other squares on the board are that would have the same number. So for instance, we could draw a line between the 4th and 5th ranks and make that a mirror. And if we flip the knight in that mirror to the other side, to h1, the mirror across I can't draw a line exactly between the 4th and 5th ranks because it really should go straight across. But if that was a mirror, the mirror between h1 is h8, just like the mirror between h2 is h7 and h3 is h6 and h4 is h5. So if you're in a mirror square, you should have the same number of moves that you had before, and the squares you're moving to should be mirrors of the same place. We also can get this by a mathematical process called translation and rotation. With rotation, if we rotate the board 90 degrees clockwise from h1, you end up, from h8, you end up with h1. If you rotate the board 90 degrees counterclockwise from h8, you get a8, and if we put a knight on a8, therefore it should also have 2. And clearly that should also be true if we rotate another 90 degrees here. So if we put a knight on every square where the knight has 2, it's the 4 corners of the board. Now that doesn't prove yet that there's no other squares where it has 2, but it turns out it is. Okay, let's take those pieces off the board. Now, if we move the knight over one square from h8 to g8, the 2 squares that he could move to before, which were to the left and upper left, are now joined by one extra square that moves into the constellation of the moves. So the knight on g8 has 3 moves, and now we can do a mirror across the h8 to a1 line, and everything in the mirror should look the same. So the mirror of that move, of that square in this line, I'll draw it all the way, is knight here. And these 3 moves should have mirrors in that same lines in the mirror, and they are this move, and this move. So the knights there have 2 moves, and therefore, 3 moves, and therefore there's 2 squares in each corner where the knight has 3 moves. It should always end up being symmetric because the pawn is the only piece on the board where it doesn't move symmetric. It moves only in one direction. All the other pieces, the king, the knight, the bishop, the queen, and the rook, are all symmetric. It doesn't matter. So whatever direction you happen to have the board or whatever direction you're sitting in, the pieces should always move the same. So if the piece moves the same in one corner, it should move the same in all the corners because the board is perfectly square and the piece moves are symmetric. So therefore we've got all of those knight moves have 3. All right, where do they have 4? All right, let's clear the board. If we go over one more, we now see we still have the same 3 moves that we had before, but we have a new one moving onto the board, a 4th move there. So the knight there has 4. And if we move over one more and put a knight over on e8, it has the exact same 4 shifted over 1 that it had on f8. So these 2 squares have 4. All right, what about if we move the knight up to g7? When we were on g8, the 3 moves were here, here, and here. So therefore, if we move up 1, we should have the same 3, which are here, here, and here. But now we've gained 1 in the other direction here, which we didn't have on g8. So g7 also has 4. So if we put the knight in those 3 squares, and now we use symmetry and rotation, we could see that all these squares that look like this should all have 4 knight moves if the knight is on those squares. Okay, Mr. Mouse, let me move the knight here. All right, so we should end up with a nice symmetric structure of 4 moves each for potential mobility. Okay, like so. All right, those are the squares with 4. Let's move in some more to here. Now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, and if we move the knight over to here, we should have the same 6. 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, and now, again, using symmetry and rotation, the squares on the board that have 6 should look like this. Whoops, mouse slip. Not surprisingly, we're going to end up again with this nice symmetric pattern. There we go. All the squares where the knight has 6 moves. So that leaves the middle 16 squares. And not surprisingly, on those squares, the knight with potential mobility will have 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on all 16 central squares. We don't get extra by moving past the edge of this square. So we get the full complement of the full locus of 8 squares for the knight. All right, so those are the knight's potential mobility values. Let's take a look at the bishop's potential mobility values. There's our knight where they have 8. If we put a bishop in the corner, it clearly has 7 squares it can move to. Let's move it off the corner by 1. Now we've got 2 directions we can go instead of 1, but one of the directions is shorter than before. So in that shorter direction we have 6 squares, and in the new direction we have 1. So I shouldn't say the shorter because it's longer than the 1, but it's shorter than the long diagonal was. So we don't have 7 anymore on the longer one. We have 6, and we have 1 more, so we have 7 again. If we move over to F8, the longer of the 2 diagonals now has 5, and the shorter has 2. And over here, the longer has 4, and the shorter has 3. So the bishop has 7 moves in all these, and again, by rotation and translation, I'm not going to put all those bishops on the board. All the squares on the outer rim, the bishop has 7. All right, let's take the bishop off the board. If we move it off the outer rim to here, we now have 4 directions we can move. 1 in the upper right, 6 in the lower right, 1 upper left, 1 lower right for a total of 9. If we move it over left, we've got 5 lower left, 2 lower right, 1 upper right, 1 upper left, also 9. Bishop here, 4, 3, 1, 1. We also have 9. So we have these 3 squares have 9, and again by translation, rotation, symmetry, we've got all the squares in the concentric square, 1 in from the edge, the bishop has 9. Not surprisingly, if we go into one more concentric square, here, the bishop has 2 that way, 2 that way, 2 that way, 5 that way, 11. Bishop here has 4, 3, 2, 2, also 11. So now we've got another concentric square where the bishop has 11. And finally, in the 4 central squares, let's clear out the board. Bishop here has 4 to the lower left, 3 to the lower right, 3 to the upper right. Don't mean to move the bishop. 3 to the upper left. That's a total of 13. So in the 4 central squares, the bishop has 13 potential mobility. All right, so let's compare the bishop with the knight. The bishop has a potential mobility of 7 in the corner, and the knight in a corner has a potential mobility of 2. 7 to 2, that's a gigantic difference, 3.5 times more mobility. How about in the center of the board? All right, let's put a bishop in the center. And we're assuming the board is empty, so I'll empty it just for the fun of it. And we'll put a knight in the center. The bishop in the center has 13, the knight only has 8. So clearly the bishop has a lot more potential mobility than the knight does. It just does. Well, but why is that negated a little bit? Well, on a board, we never have an empty board. There's always other pieces on the board. And when you're on an actual board with an actual position, let's set one up. Now in these positions, you have to count the mobility the piece actually has. Well, in the initial position, the knight has 2 of its 3 potential moves are available, but the bishops all have 0. So why is that noticeable? Well, first of all, as we all know, knights can jump over pieces, which means they're not easily blocked. In fact, the rule is the only time a knight's actual mobility is less than its potential mobility is if A, it's pinned to the king, in which case it can't move at all, or more likely B, one of the squares that its potential mobility could have it move to is occupied by a piece of the same color. So for instance, if you have a white knight on G1 and you have a white pawn on E2 here, the knight can't go to that square because the pawn is of the same color. If that was a black pawn, the knight could go there and capture it. So what we're seeing is the knight's actual mobility in real positions is often closer, in fact almost always closer to its potential mobility than the bishop. With the bishop, it doesn't take much to block it. For instance, let's clear off the board again and we'll put the bishop on H1 where it has a potential mobility of 7. If we simply put a pawn on G2, I know that's impossible in a real game. The bishop couldn't get there. But if we block the bishop with the pawn like this, the bishop's potential mobility is still 7, but its actual mobility is 0. because it can't jump over the pawn, and even though the rest of the diagonal is completely empty, just that one pawn there prevents it. Even if that was a black pawn and it was white's turn, in this position the bishop could actually have gotten there. In this position, the bishop still only has a mobility of 1. It can capture the pawn on g2, but it can't jump over it and move to f3, e4, d5, and so on. So the bishop's potential mobility is easily blocked. And we have a name for bishops whose potential mobility is very severely blocked by, let's say, its own pawns, and you can't move those pawns out of the way. We call that a bad bishop. But you rarely hear the term a bad knight. It is possible to have a bad knight, but it's much more common to have a bad bishop. And that's because the bishops can't achieve its potential mobility as easily when the other pieces are in the way, and especially their own pieces that can't easily move out of the way. All right, let's talk about another concept. Let's talk about speed. Speed is the ability of a piece to move all the way across the board in as few moves as possible. A bishop is as fast as any piece in chess. Rooks and queens and bishops are only blocked when they move across the board by something in the way. Otherwise, they can keep moving on a straight line. So, for instance, this bishop on h1 can go from the first rank to the 8th rank in one move. And if I put the bishop on any square on the first rank and the board is empty, the most it's going to take it is 2 moves to get to the other side of the board. So the bishop is very fast. A knight, on the other hand, is fairly slow. In order for the knight to get from the first rank to the 8th rank, a knight needs at least 4 moves. 1, 2, 3, 4 to get to the other side. So knights are much slower than bishops. Now, I've had people say to me, yes, but you're talking about the same thing. The speed of a piece and the mobility of a piece are almost the same thing. Well, they are correlated and they are cousins, but they're not almost the same thing. And I usually come up with a counterexample. I say, let's create a new piece called a super king. A super king can move anywhere where a king could move in 2 moves. It can move in 1 move. All right, so if I put a super king on f3, it can go to every single one of these squares in a 5x5 square here in 1 move, because it can move like a king for 2 moves. So if you wanted to go to e3, you could simply play e2, e3 as your 2 king moves. So you could reach any of these other 24. Obviously, you shouldn't be able to move back to your own square, but that way you could avoid zugzwang. So you can only move to the other 24 squares. So this king has tremendous mobility. It has 24 squares it can go to, which, even compares almost as much as a queen in the middle of the board. So if we put the super king back on the first rank, how long does it take it to get to the 8th rank? Well, the best it can do is move up 2, and then 2 again, and 2 again, and then 1. It's just like a knight. It's going to take it 4 moves to go from the first rank to the 8th rank. So this king is relatively slow, but it's massively mobile. And the bishop is not nearly as mobile as a super king that can move 2, but it's much, much faster. And of course, if the board was infinitely long, the king could still only move to 24 squares, and the bishop could move to an infinite number of squares. Of course, we're always playing chess on an 8x8 board, so the bishop's moves are finite, and the bishop's mobility is therefore much finite. And the bishop at most can have 13 moves in the middle of the board, and the king in the middle of the super king, in the middle of the board has 24. So this is an example where one piece has a lot more mobility, but the other piece has a lot more speed. Okay, well, we've seen that bishops have greater potential mobility than a knight, and we've seen that bishops have greater speed than a knight, but we've also seen that knights can jump over pieces, and their actual mobility is closer to their potential mobility. And we've also seen that knights are not easily blocked, which also makes their actual mobility closer to their potential mobility. All right, there's another concept I call global mobility. Let's say you've got pawns on a bunch of squares that you need to attack. And we'll put up some black pawns on the board. Whoops, let's put it on a dark square just for the fun of it. And let's say the kings are all tied up doing something, and you've got a knight, and your knight needs to go over and start capturing these pawns. Well, it's not going to have any trouble doing that. You're going to figure out a path to get there. You're going to say, okay, I'm going to play knight here, take off the pawn, come back, take this one, come back, take this one, go up to c8, take this one. You know, and you could visit any square. If one of those pawns was on white, it wouldn't make any difference. You could find a path to get there. That's because the knight, like every other piece, except one, the global mobility is all 64 squares. That global meaning throughout the whole game. The problem with the bishop is, let's say you have a white squared bishop. These pawns are basically invisible to that bishop. Half the squares on the board to the bishop don't even exist. If a king was running up through the dark squares, the bishop would never know. The bishop just can't see the squares of the opposite color, which is one of the reasons why the bishop pair is so important, because it completely gets rid of that deficit. When you have the bishop pair, you have two bishops and your opponent does not, then you're able to cover all the squares of the board, which greatly negates each bishop's weakness of only being able to see half the squares of the board, only the squares of its color. So this is one great advantage a knight has over a bishop, which is the knight's global mobility is 64 and the bishop's global mobility is only 32. Now, when I first wrote my book, Elements of Positional Evaluation, these were the main differences I talked about between the knight and the bishop. And some people said, well, yes, and also for beginners, knights are tricky. They're not a piece that moves in a straight line, and therefore people have trouble with knight moves because knights move differently, and it's easier to miss a knight move or a knight fork, and that gives a knight some advantage. Well, okay, but when Larry Kaufman was measuring Grandmaster games, they weren't really subject to that nearly as much. So it's true psychologically and in speed games that the knight is more of a tricky piece and can be somewhat more valuable that way, but theoretically that's not part of the issue. But there is part of an issue that I missed in my first couple editions of the book that I think I added in my fourth edition. And I call that kind of the new direction issue. So let's clear out the board for a second and we'll show you what I mean. Right now, let's put a bishop on f3, and we're going to move him to any square. Let's say we move him to d5. Notice right now the bishop has 4 directions it can go. It can go lower right, upper left, upper right, upper left. And when I move the bishop to any square, I have to retain 2 of those directions. So when I go to d5, before I could go down right and up left to get to this diagonal, but when I go to d5, I still retain those same squares down left and up right. There's nothing new about the squares I'm attacking along that diagonal. What is new is these 2 directions right here. So if I was already attacking something, let's put my bishop back on f3, and I was attacking, you know, a pawn on b7 or something. When I move to d5, I'm still attacking that same pawn because he's on that original diagonal. The only new pieces I'm attacking are here and here. So if I wanted to make a double attack of 2 pieces that I'm currently not attacking, they would have to be on these 2 new diagonals. So for instance, if I put a knight on g8 and a knight on a2, then I can play bishop d5 and all of a sudden attack 2 knights that I wasn't attacking before because they're in the 2 new directions that I can go, even though I can't draw straight lines. Okay? Now, if both knights were in the same side, let's take that move back. Let's put the knight on e6 instead. Now when I go here, I have now created a skewer instead of a double attack because they're both in that same new direction of going from d5 up through g8. All right, what's this got to do with comparing a knight and a bishop? Well, the answer is a lot, because if we put a knight on f3 instead of a bishop, it has our 8 moves that we went to before. We already looked at this. But when you move a knight to a new square, let's say we go to d4, and we draw the 8 moves it has from d4. Whoops. Draw the 8 moves. Notice that only one of those 8 going back to f3 affects any of the squares that I was on before. If you go back to f3 and draw the same 8 moves for the knight, none of them are the same as the knight move now. I have all new squares, and that makes sense because f3 is white, which means I'm moving to all black squares, and d4 is black, which means I'm moving to all white squares. So obviously none of the white squares can be the same as any of the black squares, but one of those 8 is the square I came from, so I can't be attacking anything on the square I came from, because clearly when you move a piece from one square to another, the piece that it came from has to now be empty. Okay, but when we move the knight to d4, we have 7 new directions for double attack. The bishop could only have 2. This is actually another advantage that the knight has that I didn't realize when I wrote my first edition of my book 45 years ago. Again, we're talking about the book Elements of Positional Evaluation, which was my first chess book. So when I wrote that book, I did not include the fact that when a knight moves, it has 7 new directions to double attack pieces on, while a bishop only has 2. That's why a knight, when he comes up and all of a sudden forks you or seems to come out of nowhere, seems to attack all these new squares, and you don't see that as much with a bishop. It's not just that the knight moves in a tricky manner and he's not moving in a straight line. Yes, psychologically that does have something to do with it, but it actually is a clear mathematical thing where the knight is moving to 7 new directions and the bishop's only moving to 2. Now the bishop may be moving to a bunch of new squares, maybe, you know, almost as many new squares as the knight's moving to, but there's still only 2 directions that it can go and to hit a new piece. While my knight could move here and hit 7 new pieces, I could actually move my knight from f3 to d4 and have a fork of 7 black pieces on that square. The bishop can't do that. So this is an advantage that the knight has over the bishop. So if you're using Larry's more sophisticated evaluation formula for the value of the knights and the bishops, and I won't get into his most sophisticated stuff, but his average value right now, and this includes all positions, you know, it's not special at any specific position where it changes. He says knights and bishops on the average are worth about 3.5 pawns. I think his latest article on this is in his book, The Kaufman Repertoire in Black and White. And I also have an article on my website. If you just Google the evaluation of material imbalances, that's the article Larry wrote 20 years ago for Chess Life, where he did this initial calculation on the average value of the pieces. So whether you consider the knight and the bishop both to be worth 3.5, or you want to stick with your Reinfeld values of 3, the knight and the bishop are about the same, but as we've seen in today's video, this sameness comes from tremendously different pros and cons. The bishop is much faster. It can go all the way across the board. It doesn't have to be developed quite as early because it can jump all the way across the board. The bishop has much greater potential mobility. The knight's actual mobility, though, is closer to its potential mobility, even though it's lower. The knight can jump over pieces. The knight is slower, but it can get these new squares. And, as we said, the knight has global mobility of 64. The bishop only has 32. What's the net result? Amazingly, it comes out to almost exactly the same on the average. Knights versus bishops. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed today's video on the theory of knights versus bishops. If you enjoy the channel, then please subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.